There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend leaning against you on a couch. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden, cinematic shift in lighting. There is only the slow, creeping realization, much later, that the entire landscape of your world tilted on the axis of that seemingly insignificant second. For me, that moment was a breath. Just a single, sleeping exhalation from Julian, his chest rising and falling against mine, his head tucked into the hollow of my shoulder. It was a breath that carried a name on its tide, a name that was not mine and not his, but someone from a past he claimed to have buried. And in the absolute stillness of my living room, under the amber glow of a single lamp, that ghost of a word was the first tremor of the earthquake to come. He was asleep, of course. He was almost always asleep when he was like this, draped over me as if I were a piece of furniture he had claimed in some drowsy, instinctual act of possession. It had become our ritual, this strange and silent configuration. A ritual born of his exhaustion and my secret, hopeless vigilance. I was the keeper of his quiet, the guardian of his rest, and in those hours, my world shrank to the space we occupied. It was a kingdom of soft upholstery and shared warmth, bordered by the shadows that crept into the corners of the room. I had learned the cartography of his sleep, the subtle twitch of his fingers when a dream took a sharp turn, the deepening of his breathing as he slipped from a light doze into the profound depths of true slumber, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of his shampoo, a clean, green apple fragrance that I had long ago cataloged and stored away in the part of my brain reserved for dangerous things. I was a photographer. My life was spent in observation, in waiting for the precise instant when light and shadow and subject conspired to reveal a hidden truth. I trained myself to see the things that existed between the ticks of a clock, the subtle shifts in expression, the unguarded gestures that told a more honest story than words ever could. And I had been observing Julian for 7 years. I had documented him in my mind's eye, creating a vast, secret portfolio of his existence. Julian laughing so hard that his eyes squeezed shut. Julian staring out a window, his shoulders slumped with a weariness he never admitted to. Julian running a hand through his perpetually messy hair, a gesture of frustration that was so uniquely him. But this was different. This wasn't observation from a distance. This was a tactile study, a sensory immersion so complete it often left me feeling dizzy and unmoored. The solid weight of him was an anchor, pinning me to the present, while my mind spiraled with the terrifying velocity of what if. For months, this ritual had been our unspoken language. He would arrive on a Friday, shed the skin of his week as a high-flying consultant, the sharp suit, the sharper smile, the air of relentless competence, and collapse into a softer, more vulnerable version of himself. He never explained why he chose my couch, my quiet apartment, over his own sleek, empty condo downtown. He never had to. His own space was a testament to his transient life. Minimalist, impersonal, a place to store his luggage between flights. My apartment, by contrast, was lived in, cluttered with books and camera equipment and the comforting ghosts of finished projects. It was a home. It was a harbor. And Julian, I had come to understand, was a ship in constant need of a port. I was that port, a safe, quiet, and, most importantly, platonic harbor where he could drop anchor without any expectation of a longer voyage. That was the story we told ourselves, anyway. It was a convenient and necessary fiction. But that night, the fiction began to fray. The breath, the whispered name, it was Sarah, was a stone tossed into the placid surface of our arrangement. It wasn't the name itself that jolted me. Sarah was his ex, the reason this whole ritual had begun in the first place. It was the way he'd said it, not with pain or anger or longing, but with a simple, declarative finality, like a door being closed for the last time. It was the sound of an ending. And as he shifted, burrowing his face deeper into my shirt, as if seeking a more permanent foundation, I felt a terrifying, unbidden thought rise up in me, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. If that door is closing, is another one about to open? I held my breath, listening to the frantic, traitorous thrum of my own heart, and I knew. with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that nothing would ever be ordinary again. The watershed moment had arrived, disguised as a sleepy sigh, and I was already caught in its current. We met in a library, which felt, in retrospect, like a parody of our future dynamic. I was there to study, to lose myself in the hushed cathedral of knowledge, while he was there because it was the only place on campus open 24 hours where he could loudly and dramatically complain about his group project. I was tucked into a solitary corral in the deepest, most forgotten corner of the third floor, surrounded by dusty tomes on Byzantine art. I had chosen the spot specifically for its isolation. It was a fortress of solitude, and I was its contented king. Then Julian arrived, not like a person entering a room, but like a weather system making landfall. He wasn't alone. He was with two beleaguered-looking classmates, and his voice, a rich baritone full of exasperated energy, sliced through the sacred silence. I remember looking up, annoyed, ready to shoot a glare of pure academic fury in his direction. And then I saw him. He was all motion and light, even under the library's sterile fluorescent glow. He was wearing a ridiculously worn-out college sweatshirt, jeans with a hole in the knee, and a backwards baseball cap from which strands of dark, unruly hair escaped. He was pacing, gesturing wildly with his hands as he dissected the failings of a teammate named Kevin. He had this incredible energy, a kind of unself-conscious charisma that drew the eye and held it. He wasn't classically handsome in the way of a magazine model, but his face was a fascinating landscape of sharp angles and expressive features. His eyes, a deep, warm brown, were alight with frustration, and his mouth was set in a frown that somehow still hinted at the ghost of a smile. I forgot to be annoyed. I was just watching. Eventually, his friends, defeated, packed up and left him to his tirade. He stood there for a moment, alone in the aisle, and let out a huge, frustrated sigh that seemed to deflate his entire body. He ran a hand through his hair, knocking his cap askew, and then his eyes scanned the floor, finally landing on me, huddled in my corner. I braced myself, expecting him to either not see me at all or to offer a perfunctory, apologetic grimace. He did neither. He walked over, a sheepish grin spreading across his face, transforming him from a minor campus celebrity into just a guy. "Sorry," he said, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper. "Did I just ruin your concentration for, like, the next decade?" I felt a stupid smile tug at my own lips. "It's holding on for dear life," I admitted. "But it's a fighter." He laughed, a genuine, quiet laugh that was a world away from the booming complaints of a moment before. "I'm Julian," he said, extending a hand. "Leo," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, warm. "So," he said, leaning against the bookshelf opposite me, his hip brushing against a row of books on Renaissance architecture. "Byzantine art, huh? Heavy stuff for a Tuesday night." I remember being struck by the fact that he'd bothered to read the titles on the spines around me. Most people's eyes would have glazed over. "Someone's got to keep the Byzantines relevant," I said, trying for a casualness I absolutely did not feel. My heart was doing a strange, unfamiliar staccato rhythm against my ribs. It was the first time I had ever felt seen by someone who wasn't paid to critique my work. That was the beginning. He ended up pulling a chair over, and we talked for hours, our voices low, the library's silence a conspirator in our sudden intimacy. He told me about his business degree, his dream of starting his own company, his chaotic family. I told him about photography, about my obsession with capturing moments that felt more real than the reality that contained them. It was effortless. Talking to him was like slipping into a current and letting it carry you. He was curious and engaging, and he listened, truly listened, in a way that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world. By the time the sun started to hint at its return, staining the high, arched windows a pale, bruised purple, I felt like I had known him for years. As we walked out into the crisp morning air, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Leo, the Byzantine guardian," he said with a grin. "We should do this again, but maybe with less complaining about Kevin." And we did. Our friendship wasn't a slow build. It was a sudden and complete annexation. He folded me into his life, and I, in turn, carved out a space for him in my much quieter one. He would drag me to parties where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, and he would invariably find his way back to me, a drink in each hand, ready to dissect the social dynamics like a field anthropologist. I would show him my contact sheets, and he would stare at the grids of tiny black and white images, pointing out the one he thought was the one, with an uncanny, intuitive accuracy. He appreciated my quiet, and I was fascinated by his noise. We were a study in contrasts, an unlikely pairing that made perfect sense to us and no one else. He was the prose, and I was the punctuation. He was the vibrant, sprawling narrative, and I was the quiet, deliberate period that gave it shape and pause. The shift in my own feelings was a subtle, insidious thing. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, inexorable turning of a season. I don't remember a specific day. I remember a collection of moments, like a series of photographs that, when laid out together, told a story I hadn't realized was being written. It was watching him across a crowded dining hall, laughing with a group of friends, and feeling a pang of something sharp and proprietary. It was the casual way he'd sling an arm around my shoulders, a gesture he bestowed on many, but which felt, on me, like a brand. It was the hollow ache I felt when he started dating Sarah, a bright, kind girl from his economics class who was, by all accounts, perfect for him. Seeing them together was like looking at a photograph that was slightly out of focus. It was almost right, but some crucial element was misaligned. I liked Sarah. I genuinely did. But I was hyper-aware of her hand on his arm, of the way he would look at her, of the shared, private universe they were building, a universe from which I was necessarily excluded. The ache wasn't jealousy in its ugliest form. It was a deeper, more profound loneliness. It was the realization that the space I occupied in his life, as important as it was, had a clearly defined border. I was his best friend, his confidant, his quiet harbor. But I was not, and could never be, the person he came home to. I was the prologue, not the main story. So I built walls, not against him, but around myself. I constructed a careful, internal architecture to house my feelings. It was a room with no windows and a single, heavily bolted door. Inside, I could admit the truth, that I was in love with my straight best friend, that the sound of his laugh was my favorite sound, that the thought of a future without him in it felt like a kind of death. But on the outside, I was just Leo. Dependable, quiet, platonic Leo. I became an expert in emotional self-preservation. I learned to interpret his casual affection as just that, casual. I learned to metabolize the small stabs of pain into a low, manageable hum of melancholy. Our friendship was a masterpiece of careful construction, a beautiful, delicate thing I had helped to build. And I would have sooner set fire to my own darkroom than risk doing anything that might cause it to collapse. I loved him enough to let him be happy with someone else. I loved him enough to remain silent. It was a silent, solemn vow I made to myself, in the windowless room of my own heart. The call that heralded the shift came on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was late, after midnight, and the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand was a violent intrusion into the quiet dark. I saw Julian's name on the screen, and my first thought was a jolt of alarm, a car accident, a family emergency. He never called this late. We were texters, communicators in short, efficient bursts. A phone call felt archaic, reserved for news that couldn't be contained in a blue bubble. I answered, my voice thick with sleep. Julian? Is everything okay? There was a pause on the other end, a cavernous silence filled only with the faint, telltale sound of rain hitting a windshield. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ghost of itself. It was flat, hollowed out, stripped of all its usual warmth and energy. She left me, he said. Just that. 3 words. But they were heavy enough to sink a ship. Sarah? I asked, stupidly, as if it could have been anyone else. Yeah, he breathed. She packed her stuff this afternoon while I was at work. Left a note on the counter. A goddamn note. He wasn't crying. In some ways, that was worse. Crying would have been a release, a storm. This was the eerie, oppressive calm that follows a Category 5 hurricane, when the world is flattened and silent and unrecognizable. Where are you? I asked, already swinging my legs out of bed, pulling on a pair of sweatpants. My own apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now felt like a holding cell. I needed to be where he was. I don't know, he said, and I heard the listlessness in his voice, the sound of a man who had lost his coordinates. Driving. I think I'm near your neighborhood. That was all I needed to hear. Come here, I said. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a command. A lighthouse cutting through the fog. Just come here, he didn't argue. He just said, okay, and the line went dead. 15 minutes later, there was a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, he was standing there, drenched. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his expensive work coat was soaked through, hanging heavy on his shoulders. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They were empty. The vibrant, crackling fire that was always there, the defining feature of his entire being, was just gone. He looked like a stranger wearing Julian's face. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and in that look, I saw the full, terrifying scope of his devastation. He was adrift, and he had steered his wreckage toward my shore. I stepped aside and he walked in, dripping onto the hardwood floor. He moved with a slow, mechanical stiffness, like an automaton whose power was about to run out. He stopped in the middle of my living room and just stood there, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He was a statue of grief. I didn't know what to do. The usual script of our friendship had been incinerated. There were no jokes to be made, no easy reassurances to offer. All the tools I normally used to navigate our interactions were useless, so I fell back on the practical. Take off your coat, I said, my voice softer than I intended. You'll catch a cold. He obeyed without a word, shrugging out of the heavy, wet wool. I took it from him and hung it over a chair, where it immediately began to form a puddle. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and handed it to him. He took it, but just held it, staring at the woven cotton as if he didn't know what it was for. Gently, I took it back from his hands and started drying his hair, my fingers moving with a careful, deliberate slowness. He closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of absolute surrender. In that moment, he wasn't Julian, the unstoppable force. He was just a man, cold and heartbroken and utterly, profoundly lost. I felt a surge of something fierce and protective, an emotion so potent it almost buckled my knees. It was the love I kept locked away, but it had broken out of its room, and it was no longer quiet or manageable. It was a roaring, defensive fire. I don't want to talk about it, he finally whispered, his eyes still closed. Okay, I said, my own voice barely a whisper back. We don't have to talk. I finished drying his hair and draped the towel around his neck. He looked exhausted, transparent. The facade of the successful consultant had crumbled, and what was left was something raw and fragile. Sit down, I said, guiding him toward the couch. He sank into the cushions, his body seeming to lose all its structural integrity at once. I turned on the television to a nature documentary, something with sweeping landscapes and a calm, British narrator. I turned the volume down low, so it was just a murmur in the background. I made him a cup of tea, strong and sweet, and placed it in his hands. He held the mug, letting the steam warm his face, but he didn't drink. We sat there for hours, in the semi-darkness, the silent television painting shifting colors on the walls. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the window panes. I didn't push him to talk. I didn't ask questions. I just sat with him, a quiet, constant presence in the landscape of his pain. I was providing the one thing his sleek, empty apartment couldn't, the silent, unassuming comfort of another human being. At some point, deep in the night, his head began to nod. His grip on the mug loosened. I carefully took it from him before it could fall and placed it on the coffee table. His eyes fluttered open for a second, found mine, and then closed again. Slowly, tentatively, like a glacier moving an inch a century, he listed sideways until his head came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. This was new territory. This was a breach of the unspoken treaty that had governed our friendship for 7 years. My mind screamed at me to move, to gently disengage, to restore the safe and established boundary. But his breathing was already deepening, a ragged, exhausted sound. He was seeking refuge, not intimacy. He was a wounded animal crawling into a cave to feel safe. To reject him now would have been an act of cruelty. So I stayed. I sat there, ramrod straight, my muscles screaming in protest, and I let him sleep. I was his anchor, his wall, his quiet place. It was the beginning of the shift, the first step into a new, uncharted territory. I didn't know it then, but the foundation of our friendship was being systematically dismantled, and something new, something terrifying and beautiful, was being built in its place. and I was both the architect and the material. That first night established the blueprint for what was to come. It created a precedent. The act of him seeking physical comfort from me, and me providing it, was no longer unthinkable. It had happened. The seal was broken. And once a thing has happened, it can happen again. The next Friday, he texted me in the afternoon. Order from that Thai place. It was our usual routine, but after the events of that week, nothing felt usual. It felt loaded, a question beneath the question. He was asking if the harbor was still open. I texted back, already have the menu open. When he arrived that evening, the ghost of the previous Tuesday hung in the air between us. He looked better, more put together. He was wearing his usual weekend uniform of a soft hoodie and jeans. He had shaved. The hollowed-out look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, settled weariness, which was, I suppose, a form of progress. We ate on the floor, sitting on cushions around my coffee table, the way we always did. He talked about his week, about a frustrating client and a delayed flight. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by brick, reassembling the persona of Julian, the competent professional. He didn't mention Sarah. He didn't mention the note on the counter. He didn't mention standing drenched and broken in the middle of my living room. I let him. I understood the need for denial, for the semblance of normalcy. It was a form of self-preservation. But as the night wore on, I could see the cracks forming in his carefully reconstructed facade. The pauses between his sentences grew longer. His shoulders, which had been straight and confident, began to slump. We put on a movie, some mindless action flick he'd been wanting to see. He sat at one end of the couch, and I at the other, a chasm of 3 feet of upholstery between us. It was a conscious, deliberate distance, a mutual retreat to the safety of our old boundaries. For the first hour, it worked. We were just 2 friends watching a movie. Then, during a particularly loud and explosive car chase, he shifted. He stretched his legs out, propping his feet up on the coffee table. He leaned back, his head hitting the cushion. And then, slowly, he slid down, his body moving with a liquid languor until he was lying flat on the couch, his head in my lap. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen, as if this were the most natural, unremarkable thing in the world. "Your couch is ridiculously uncomfortable," he murmured, a faint, teasing note in his voice. "You're a much better pillow." My breath hitched. There it was. The plausible deniability. The joke that served as a passport into this new, intimate territory. It wasn't a desperate, grief-stricken collapse like before. This was a choice. A conscious one. He was testing the waters, seeing if the comfort I had offered in a crisis was available on a more permanent basis. My mind went into overdrive. Every nerve ending in my thighs, where the weight of his head now rested, was screaming. I could feel the warmth of him through the denim of my jeans. I could smell that green apple shampoo. I wanted to run. I wanted to stay. I wanted to thread my fingers through his messy hair. I did none of those things. I simply sat there, my body a statue of feigned nonchalance, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I made a non-committal humming sound, my eyes glued to the explosions on the screen, pretending that my entire world hadn't just been fundamentally reoriented. That was the beginning of the ritual. It became our new normal. Every Friday, and sometimes on a random Wednesday if his week had been particularly brutal, he would come over. We would eat, we would talk, and then we would migrate to the couch. The initial pretense of watching a movie was soon abandoned. Sometimes we'd put on music, low and instrumental. Sometimes we'd just exist in the quiet. He would lie down, his head finding its now familiar place in my lap, or, more often as the weeks went on, he would stretch out beside me, tucking himself against my side and resting his head on my chest. He never asked. He just did it. And I never stopped him. I just let it happen. Each time was a fresh ordeal for my nervous system. I was a seismologist living on a fault line, constantly monitoring for the slightest tremor. I became a scholar of his physical presence. I learned the exact weight of his head on my sternum. I learned that he sometimes ground his teeth in his sleep when he was stressed about a deadline. I learned that when a particular piece of music moved him, his fingers would tap out a silent rhythm against my ribs. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, was transformed into a laboratory for the study of unspoken things. The couch was our petri dish, a contained environment where this strange, unclassifiable specimen of intimacy was allowed to grow. My internal monologue during these sessions was a raging, chaotic debate. One part of me, the pragmatic, self-protective part, was screaming warnings. He's using you, Leo. You're a human security blanket. He's lonely and heartbroken, and you're convenient. Don't mistake proximity for affection. Don't build a home in a temporary shelter. This voice was cynical and cruel, but it was rooted in the deep, primal fear of getting hurt. It reminded me that he was Julian, my straight best friend, who was simply navigating the wreckage of a heterosexual relationship. But there was another voice, a quieter, more hopeful one. This voice was a treacherous whisper in the dark. It pointed out the things the cynical voice ignored. It pointed out that he had dozens of friends, many of them women, who would have gladly offered a shoulder to cry on. But he didn't go to them. He came to me. He came to my quiet. It pointed out the moments of breathtaking vulnerability, when he would sigh in his sleep, a sound of such profound contentment that it felt like a confession. It pointed out the way he fit against me, the easy, unthinking way our bodies slotted together, as if they were two halves of a long-forgotten whole. This voice told me to be patient, to watch, to wait. It spoke to me in the language of my own art. This is darkroom work, it would say. You can't force the image to appear. You have to let it develop in its own time. Just control the conditions. Keep the light out. Be patient. The line between comfort and something more began to blur into non-existence. One night, I fell asleep while he was asleep on me. I woke up hours later, sometime in the dead of night, with a stiff neck and my arm, which had been draped over his back, completely numb. He was still there, a warm, solid weight. In that disoriented, pre-dawn moment, it felt completely natural. It felt like this was where he was supposed to be. The panic and the overanalysis were gone, replaced by a simple, sleepy sense of rightness. The fear returned, of course, as soon as I was fully awake, but that fleeting moment of peace was a revelation. It was a glimpse of a potential reality I had never dared to imagine. I became obsessed with boundaries, both physical and metaphorical. The living room was our sanctioned space of ambiguity, but the rest of my apartment remained mine. My darkroom was off limits, a private, alchemical space he never asked to see, and my bedroom door remained closed. Always. It was a symbolic barrier, a line in the sand. The couch was a place of temporary, deniable closeness. My bed was a place of intention, of permanence. And he never, ever made a move toward it. He would wake up on the couch in the early hours of the morning, untangle himself from me with a quiet murmur of apology for having fallen asleep, and let himself out, leaving me alone in the silent aftermath, my body still holding the ghost of his warmth, my mind a tangled mess of hope and fear. The ritual was both a profound comfort and a source of exquisite torture. It was a slow, weekly crucifixion of my composure. And I endured it, because the alternative, a Friday night without him, was infinitely worse. The breaking point came, as it so often does, on the heels of a disaster. Julian had been working on a massive, career-defining project for months. It was a high-stakes, high-pressure engagement that had been consuming him. He'd been flying back and forth to Chicago every week, living on bad coffee and adrenaline. I had become the repository for his stress, the silent witness to his mounting exhaustion. The Friday the project was due to conclude, he was supposed to fly home in the evening. My text to him at 7 p.m., "Thai food is calling," went unanswered. Then another at 8. Then 9. A cold knot of worry began to tighten in my stomach. This was not like him. Even at his most stressed, he was a meticulous communicator. Just after 10, he called. I snatched the phone up. "Julian." All he said was, "It fell apart, Leo." His voice was ravaged, a raw, scraped sound. The whole thing. It all fell apart. I didn't need details. I could hear the cataclysm in his tone. "Are you at the airport?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "My flight is delayed." Weather. I could hear the tinny announcements in the background, the chaotic symphony of a travel hub in disarray. "Okay," I said, my mind racing. "Just get home. Whenever you get home, just come here, okay?" He whispered and hung up. He didn't arrive until almost 3 in the morning. I had left the door unlocked. I was on the couch, pretending to read, but I hadn't registered a single word for hours. When he walked in, he looked like a soldier returning from a long and brutal war. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his face was pale and drawn, shadowed with a dark stubble. He dropped his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud. It sounded like a final, definitive act of surrender. He walked over to the couch and just stood there, looking down at me. The air between us was thick with his defeat. This time, there was no pretense. There was no slow migration, no jokey excuse. He simply collapsed. He lay down, curling his body into a tight, protective ball, and pressed his face into the cushions next to my hip. His shoulders were shaking. He was trying to cry without making a sound, a series of ragged, suppressed hitches of breath that were more painful to listen to than any outright sob would have been. I didn't think. I just acted. I shifted, moving down to lie on my side, facing him. I pulled his head onto my chest, wrapping my arms around him, holding him close. He was trembling, a fine, high-frequency vibration of pure, unadulterated misery. We lay like that for a long time, in the dark, my hand stroking his back in a slow, steady rhythm. The ritual had always been about him leaning on me, a one-way transfer of comfort. This was different. This was an embrace. It was mutual. The boundary between provider and recipient of comfort dissolved. We were just two people, holding on to each other in the dark. Eventually, the trembling subsided. His breathing evened out. But he didn't sleep. I knew he was awake. The quality of his stillness was different. It was alert, conscious. The silence in the room changed, too. It was no longer a peaceful absence of sound. It was heavy, charged, filled with everything we had spent months not saying. I could feel his heart beating against my ribs, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to my own frantic pulse. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was a raw whisper, aimed directly at my collarbone. "Can I ask you something weird?" My throat was tight. I swallowed, trying to find my own voice. Always, I managed to rasp out. He was quiet for another long moment, as if gathering the courage to form the words. I could feel the tension in his body, the coiling of a spring. "Why do you let me do this?" he asked. The question landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. It was the question I had been asking myself for months. It was the question I had both dreaded and yearned for him to ask. The cynical voice in my head screamed, "Lie? Make a joke. Say it's nothing." It was the safe path, the one that led back to the familiar, painful comfort of the status quo. But looking down at the top of his head, at the dark, messy hair I knew so well, I felt a sudden, defiant surge of exhaustion. I was tired of the lies. I was tired of the pretense. I was tired of the windowless room in my own heart. I took a breath. "Because it feels like you need it," I said, the words simple, unadorned, and terrifyingly honest. The truth settled between us, stark and undeniable. I had laid a single, vulnerable card on the table. It was his turn to play. He was completely still for a moment, processing my answer. I could feel him thinking. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Then, he shifted, lifting his head from my chest. He propped himself up on one elbow, so he was looking down at me. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim, pre-dawn light filtering through the window, I could see the confusion and the exhaustion and something else, something new and unreadable, warring in his eyes. His gaze dropped to my mouth, and then back up to my eyes. The entire universe seemed to contract to the space between our faces. The air grew thick, heavy, difficult to breathe. He looked terrified, and he looked more present, more truly there, than I had ever seen him. He took a shaky breath. "Leo," he started, his voice cracking on my name. He swallowed and tried again. "Would it be okay?" He paused, his eyes searching mine, asking for a permission that went far beyond words. "If I kissed you?" Time stopped. The rain, the city, the entire world outside my apartment ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the air, fragile and shimmering and impossibly real. My cynical voice was silent, annihilated. My hopeful voice was screaming a single, deafening word. My carefully constructed walls, my bolted doors, my entire internal architecture crumbled to dust. There was no thought. There was no analysis. There was only a profound, gut-level certainty. I couldn't find the words to say yes. My voice was gone, so I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. He saw it. And then, with an infinite, agonizing slowness, he leaned down and pressed his mouth to mine. The kiss was not what I had imagined in 1,000 secret daydreams. It was not passionate, or demanding, or confident. It was hesitant. It was tentative. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of his exhaustion, the salt of his unshed tears, and the impossible, undeniable warmth of his lips. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was a geological event. Continents shifted. Mountains rose. The entire topography of my life was redrawn. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His breath was shaky against my cheek. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. It was a moment that existed beyond language. It was a silent, mutual crossing into a new world, and we were both too terrified and too relieved to speak its name. The silence that followed the kiss was a new and fragile thing. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of our ritual, nor was it the charged, anticipatory stillness that had preceded it. It was a silence of consequence, heavy with the weight of an irrevocable act. We stayed there, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air, for a long time. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world, adrift on the life raft of my couch. Eventually, the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep into the room, chasing away the shadows and bringing with it the harsh clarity of a new day. The spell was broken. Julian pulled away, sitting up slowly. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, which were resting on his knees, as if they were foreign objects he didn't recognize. The man who had looked at me with such raw, desperate vulnerability only moments before was gone, replaced by a stranger consumed by a quiet, frantic panic. I sat up too, a cold dread beginning to pool in my stomach. I had seen him defeated, heartbroken, and exhausted, but I had never seen him look like this. He looked hunted. "I should go," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur aimed at the floor. He stood up, the movement abrupt, jerky. He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the door, grabbed his briefcase, and was gone. The soft click of the latch closing behind him was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat there on the couch, the cushions still holding the warmth of his body, and I felt a chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. The beautiful, terrifying moment of connection had shattered, and I was left standing in the wreckage, trying to understand what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had the exhaustion and the emotion created a shared hallucination? But no, the ghost of his lips on mine was too real, a faint, tingling memory that was already starting to feel like a wound. I had spent months translating his actions, trying to develop the negative of his intentions into a clear picture. And for one brief, shining moment, I thought I had it. The image was clear. He felt something for me. But now, it was gone, dissolving back into ambiguity and shadow. The next few days were a special kind of hell. I sent him a text the following afternoon, trying for casualness, a feat of emotional acrobatics that felt almost impossible. "Hey, hope you're feeling better. Let me know if you need anything." The reply came hours later. A single, sterile sentence. "Thanks. I'm okay. Just swamped with sorting out the project fallout." It was a text you would send to a colleague, not the person you had kissed in a moment of soul-bearing vulnerability. It was a wall. A high, cold, brutally efficient wall. Friday came and went with a deafening silence. No text about Thai food. No knock on my door. The ritual was broken. The harbor was closed. My apartment, which had been a stage for our quiet drama, felt hollow and oversized. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. The couch seemed to mock me, a monument to my own foolishness. The cynical voice in my head, which had been silenced by the kiss, returned with a vengeance. "I told you so," it sneered. "You were a utility, a comfort object." He was at his lowest point, and he reached for the closest, safest thing. It didn't mean anything. You built a fantasy out of his desperation, and now you're paying the price. The hurt was a physical thing, a dull, constant ache behind my sternum. It wasn't just the pain of rejection, it was the pain of humiliation. I felt like I had fundamentally misread everything, that my skills of observation, the very core of my identity as an artist and a person, had failed me in the most crucial way imaginable. For 2 weeks, we existed in this new, frozen tundra of politeness. A few brief, functional texts were exchanged. "How's the new project?" "Busy, but good." We were strangers who knew the most intimate details of each other's lives. The dissonance was maddening. I tried to lose myself in my work, spending hours in the red-lit solitude of my darkroom. But the chemical smells and the patient process of developing images only reminded me of him, of my failed attempt to develop the truth between us. I was caught in a loop of hurt and anger and a deep, crushing disappointment. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for retreating into this fortress of silence. But mostly, I was angry at myself for letting a tiny, treacherous seed of hope grow into something so large it had shattered my peace. After the second silent Friday, something in me snapped. I couldn't live in this limbo. I couldn't go back to the way things were before, and I couldn't stay in this cold, empty space he had created. The pain of not knowing was worse than any potential pain a definitive answer could bring. I needed to burn the fog away, even if it meant scorching the earth. On Saturday afternoon, I put on my shoes, walked out of my apartment, and took the subway to his downtown condo. I had only been there a handful of times. It was his territory, a place that always felt sterile and temporary to me. Going there felt like a deliberate invasion, a crossing of a line. But he had left me no choice. He had retreated behind his walls, so I had to go and knock them down. When he opened the door, his surprise was quickly masked by a flicker of something else. Fear. He was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His apartment was a mess, which was uncharacteristic. Takeout containers were piled on the counter, and clothes were draped over a chair. The minimalist order had given way to a quiet chaos. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" He didn't invite me in. He stood in the doorway, blocking it, a human barrier. "Are you going to make me stand in the hallway?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confrontation. He hesitated for a second, then sighed and stepped aside. I walked into the living room. It was dominated by a huge, floor-to-ceiling window with a stunning view of the city, a view that felt cold and impersonal. I turned to face him. He was still standing by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What do you want, Leo?" he asked, his tone wary. "I want you to talk to me," I said, the words coming out stronger than I expected. "I want you to stop hiding behind one-sentence texts and tell me what the hell is going on. Tell me it was a mistake. Tell me you were drunk or tired or temporarily insane. Tell me to get over it. Tell me anything. But stop treating me like a stranger. I've earned more than that." The speech I hadn't realized I'd been preparing poured out of me. It wasn't angry. It was just pleading. A plea for the honesty he had once sought from me. He flinched, as if my words were physical blows. He finally moved away from the door, pacing the length of the room, running a hand through his hair in that familiar, frustrated gesture. He wouldn't look at me. "I can't," he finally said, his back to me as he stared out the window at the city below. "You can't what?" I pressed. "You can't talk to me?" "I can't explain it," he said, his voice strained. "Because I don't understand it." "Try," I said, taking a step closer. "Julian, please. Just try." He finally turned around, and what I saw on his face undid all my anger. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall, but equally terrified of turning back. "It's you," he whispered, the words barely audible. "It's always been you. The quiet, the safety. When my whole world is screaming, you're the only place that's silent. After Sarah, I was so lost. And being with you, at your place, it was the only thing that felt real. The only thing that grounded me." He took a shaky breath, his eyes locked on mine. And that night, after the project collapsed, I felt like I was literally coming apart. "And you held me together. And when I kissed you," he choked on the words, his composure finally cracking. "When I kissed you, it was the most honest thing I think I've ever done in my entire life. And it terrified me, because I've never felt that. Not for anyone. Not for Sarah. Not for a guy. I don't know what it means. What does it mean about me? What does it do to us? I felt like I took this perfect, safe thing we had, our friendship, and I broke it. I broke the most important thing in my life because I was selfish and confused, and I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I ran. I didn't know what else to do." His confession tumbled out, a torrent of fear and confusion and regret. He wasn't rejecting me. He was confessing that he was lost. And in that moment, all my hurt and anger evaporated, replaced by the same fierce, protective instinct I'd felt the night he first showed up at my door. He hadn't broken us. He was just afraid that he had. His words hung in the air of his sterile apartment, a raw and vulnerable confession that changed everything again. The narrative I had constructed in my head, of being used, of being a convenience, dissolved. The truth was far more complex and far more frightening for him than I could have imagined. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a feeling so new and profound it threatened to rewrite his entire identity. My role, I realized with a sudden, clarifying calm, was not to be the wounded party demanding an apology. It was to be what I had always been, his safe harbor. The storm was not about me. The storm was inside him. My job was to be the lighthouse. I closed the distance between us, stopping a few feet away from him. He was watching me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, pleading hope. He was waiting for my verdict. He was expecting me to be angry, to confirm his worst fears that he had irrevocably broken our friendship. "You didn't break anything," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Nothing is broken, Julian." He shook his head, a gesture of disbelief. "But I ran away. I hurt you." "Yeah, you did," I admitted. I wasn't going to lie about that. The past 2 weeks had been agonizing. But I understand why. You were scared. It's okay to be scared. He stared at me, his brow furrowed, as if he couldn't quite process my lack of anger. "You're not mad?" he asked, his voice small. I said honestly. I was hurt and confused, and I felt like a fool. But I'm not mad now. How can I be mad at you for being terrified of the same thing that's terrified me for years? The admission slipped out before I could stop it. It was my turn to be vulnerable, to offer a piece of my own truth to match his. His eyes widened slightly. The unspoken had finally been spoken. The love I had kept locked away was now out in the open, acknowledged in the space between us. "For years," he whispered. I gave a small, wry, self-deprecating smile. "You're a force of nature, Julian. It's hard not to get pulled into the orbit." I saw a flicker of a dozen emotions cross his face: shock, confusion, and then a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. He was recontextualizing 7 years of our friendship in a single instant. 7 years of my patience, my quiet presence, my willingness to be his port in a storm. He finally understood the depth of what I had been giving him. He took a hesitant step toward me, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. He reached out, not to touch me, but just holding his hand in the space between us, as if asking for permission one more time. I met him halfway, taking his hand in mine. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine with a desperate strength. We just stood there for a long moment, holding hands in the middle of his living room, the city skyline a silent, indifferent witness. It was a new kind of touch, different from the ambiguous comfort on the couch. This was intentional. It was a choice. It was an acknowledgement. "We don't have to name it," I said softly, echoing the chaos of his own thoughts back to him. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We just have to not run from it. Can we do that? Can we just not run?" He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "Okay," he breathed. The word was a promise. It was the beginning of the end of his retreat. I squeezed his hand, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt the knot of anxiety in my chest begin to loosen. The new normal had not yet begun, but the frozen winter of our misunderstanding was starting to thaw. That afternoon marked the beginning of our careful, deliberate reconstruction. We didn't fall into a grand, romantic embrace. The fear and confusion didn't just vanish. Instead, we started with the smallest, most foundational acts of togetherness. We ordered food, but instead of retreating to our separate corners, we sat together on his uncomfortable, stylish sofa, our knees occasionally brushing. The silence returned, but it was a different quality of silence now. It was a working silence, a space where we were both processing, both recalibrating. It was filled not with ambiguity, but with a fragile, shared intention. He asked me about my photography, and I told him about a new series I was planning, images of empty spaces that still held the presence of the people who had inhabited them. He listened with a new kind of intensity, as if he were hearing my words for the first time, understanding the subtext of loneliness and memory that had always been present in my work. I asked him about the failed project, and he talked, really talked, about the pressure, the disappointment, and his fear that he was becoming a person defined only by his career. In the safety of our newfound honesty, we were reintroducing ourselves to each other. As evening bled into night, a familiar exhaustion began to settle over him. I saw it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his blinks grew longer. In the old world, this would have been my cue to leave, to retreat to my own apartment and leave him to his solitude. But we were in a new world now. "You look exhausted," I said. "You should sleep," he nodded, but made no move toward his bedroom. He just looked at me, a question in his eyes he didn't know how to ask. The couch was no longer our space. It was tainted by the memory of our ritual and its collapse. We needed a new territory. I was the one to breach the topic. "Julian," I said, my voice steady, "I'm not going to leave you alone tonight. But I'm not sleeping on this couch." His gaze flickered toward his bedroom door, then back to me. The fear was still there, a shadow in the back of his eyes. "Okay," he said softly. It was his second okay of the day, and it felt even more significant than the first. He stood up and led the way to his bedroom. It was as minimalist and impersonal as the rest of the apartment, dominated by a large bed with a simple gray duvet. It was the room of a man who was never really home. He walked over to one side of the bed and pulled back the covers, then just stood there, waiting. It was a silent, profound invitation. I walked around to the other side and slid under the covers, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He turned off the light, and the room was plunged into darkness, save for the ambient, geometric glow of the city lights through the window. He got into bed, the mattress dipping with his weight. We lay there on our backs, a foot of space between us, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was absolute. This was the boundary we had never crossed, the symbolic space of ultimate intimacy. And here we were. It was terrifying, and it was peaceful. After a few minutes, I felt him shift. He rolled onto his side, facing me. I did the same. In the dim light, I could just make out the shape of his face, the outline of his shoulders. He didn't speak. He just reached out, his hand finding mine under the covers. He threaded his fingers through mine, a simple, definitive gesture that said everything he couldn't. It was not the desperate grip from earlier. It was a quiet, certain connection. I squeezed his hand, and we lay there like that, face to face in the dark, holding hands, until the rhythm of his breathing deepened and I knew he was asleep. I stayed awake for a long time, watching the faint patterns of light move across his sleeping face, feeling the steady, solid presence of his hand in mine. The fear was gone. The anxiety was gone. The endless analysis was gone. All that was left was a profound, quiet, and deeply resonant peace. We had found our way out of the storm, not by navigating back to the old harbor, but by learning to build a new one, together, in the dark. The days that followed were a lesson in the quiet architecture of a new relationship. We were building something from the ground up, and we were doing it with a careful, deliberate patience. The grand, sweeping gestures of romance you see in movies were absent. Our story was written in the margins, in the small, domestic details. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush at my apartment, a small, silent declaration of permanence. It was in the way I started bringing my laptop to his condo, my presence slowly transforming his sterile space into a shared one, cluttering his minimalist surfaces with my books and notebooks. We learned a new language, one that was spoken not just in words, but in actions. Love was him making me coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it without having to ask. It was me making sure the fridge at his place was stocked with something other than takeout menus. It was him calling me from a business trip, not to vent about his day, but just to hear my voice before he went to sleep. It was me sending him a photograph I'd taken, a picture of the way the light fell on his pillow in the morning, a silent, "I miss you." We were healing the rupture between us not with grand apologies, but with 1,000 tiny acts of care and attention. The couch at my apartment, once the fraught stage of our ambiguous ritual, was reclaimed. One evening, we were sitting there, reading in a comfortable silence, when he leaned his head on my shoulder. The gesture was so familiar it made my breath catch. But this time, there was no anxiety, no frantic internal analysis. It wasn't a man seeking a human pillow out of desperation. It was my partner, seeking a moment of simple, easy closeness. I leaned my head against his, and we just sat there, the pages of our books forgotten, content in the quiet. The ritual had been reborn, stripped of its ambiguity and imbued with the quiet certainty of love. One Saturday, he finally asked to see my darkroom. "I want to see where you make the magic happen," he said, his tone soft. I hesitated for only a second. My darkroom had always been my most private space, a sanctuary where I retreated from the world. Letting him in felt like the final, ultimate act of vulnerability. I unlocked the door and led him into the small, windowless room, with its faint, sharp smell of chemicals and its orderly chaos of trays and tongs and enlargers. I switched on the red safe light, and the room was bathed in a deep, crimson glow. He looked around, his eyes wide with a gentle curiosity. He didn't touch anything. He just observed, taking in the tools of my trade, the evidence of my patient craft. "So this is it," he said, his voice a low murmur in the strange, red light. The quiet place, he wasn't just talking about the room. He was talking about me. And in that moment, I knew that every wall I had ever built, both inside myself and in the physical world, had finally, completely, come down. There are moments in your life that you replay, not as memories, but as foundational texts. For me, it is no longer the moment of the whispered name on the couch. It is the moment in his sterile apartment, his confession of fear hanging in the air, when I chose not to be angry, but to be a harbor. It was the moment I realized that love isn't about the absence of fear, but about what you choose to do in its presence. It's about choosing to hold a hand in the dark, to offer a quiet certainty when the world is screaming, to have the courage to say, "I'm here." We don't have to run. Julian's journey was not about discovering he was gay, or straight, or bisexual. It was about discovering he was capable of a love that defied labels, a love that was rooted not in expectation or identity, but in the profound, elemental safety he felt with one specific person. He didn't fall in love with a man, he fell in love with me. And I, who had been in love with him for years, finally learned to accept that love not as a secret burden, but as a shared and livable truth. We found our way to each other not by following a map, but by getting hopelessly, terrifyingly lost, and then choosing, with intention and with courage, to find our way home together, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create.